Welcome back to the deep dive. Um, Today I want to start with a timeline that, honestly, it kind of defies the laws of physics, or at least the laws of the music industry,
It really does.
because we are looking at a band that officially legally dissolved in a high court in London in 1974. A band that, hadn't been in a recording studio together since the moon landing era.
Right.
Yet somehow, this exact same band managed to score a UK #1 single in November 2023.
It's a statistical anomaly, to say the least. I mean, you're looking at a 54-year gap between their first number one and their last.
Wow.
It's a record that I honestly don't think will ever be broken.
And obviously, for those of you listening, we are talking about the Beatles. But
Yeah.
before you think, oh, great, another biography, just hold on. That is not what we are doing today.
No, definitely not.
We aren't listing hits or doing the whole, Paul met John at a garden fete story. We are doing a forensic analysis of a breakup.
Mm.
We're going to look at exactly why the tightest unit in music history fell apart. The really messy, incredibly expensive divorce that happened behind closed doors.
And crucially, the technological miracle that allowed them to cheat time and reunite for one final song over 50 years later.
Exactly. So to get this full picture, we've pulled from a stack of pretty serious sources for this deep dive.
Yeah, we have detailed timelines of the band's disintegration from 1966 to 1970. We've got the actual legal documents regarding their brutal business battles.
The lawsuits?
Oh, the endless lawsuits. Plus, historical accounts of the 1967 death of their manager, Brian Epstein, and technical reports on the machine learning software used for that 2023 release of Now and Then.
So our mission today is to figure out how four guys who conquered the world ended up suing each other, and how a dusty 70s cassette tape finally brought them closure in the age of AI.
It's quite the journey.
It is. So let's unpack this. Because everyone knows the Beatlemania era, right? The screaming fans, the matching suits. But the sources suggest the seeds of the breakup were actually planted right in the middle of all that massive success.
That's right. To really understand the end, you have to look at 1966. On the surface, they are the biggest thing on the planet. But internally,
They were miserable.
they were completely miserable. They were trapped in this touring cycle that was literally killing their creativity.
Yeah, I was reading about that touring situation in '66, and miserable almost feels like an understatement. They were playing these massive sports stadiums like Shea Stadium, but the live sound technology, it just didn't exist yet.
Not at all.
They were plugging their instruments into what were essentially glorified public address speakers,
Yeah.
trying to drown out 50,000 screaming teenagers.
Exactly. And the result was they couldn't even hear themselves play.
That's insane for a musician.
Right. They couldn't hear their own vocals. They were just going through the motions, watching the crowd scream. It wasn't music anymore. It was just a spectacle.
There's this brutal quote from John Lennon about it in the sources. He called it a freak show.
A freak show, yes. And a circus.
A circus. He basically said the music didn't matter because nobody was listening, including the band itself. Imagine being an artist, trying to evolve, and realizing you're just a prop in a screaming match.
And that feeling of artistic futility, it forced a massive, incredibly risky decision. In 1966, they just stopped touring. Cold turkey.
Which is crazy to think about.
No, we look back and think, oh, smart move, because it gave us Skate Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. But at the time, this was considered financial suicide. Bands in the 60s made their money on the road. Stopping was completely unheard of.
So it forced them into the studio. They moved from being stage performers to being purely recording artists. And that's when the music got really complex. The loops, the orchestras, the backward tapes.
Stuff you couldn't play live even if you wanted to.
Right. So that shift changed their entire power dynamic. But just as they make this huge artistic leap, they lose the one person who kept them grounded. August 1967.
The death of their manager, Brian Epstein.
Yeah. This feels like the turning point in every tragedy. It was an accidental overdose, right?
It was, and you really cannot overstate how critical Epstein was to their dynamic. He wasn't just the manager in a pure business sense. He was the parent figure in the room. He was the ultimate mediator.
The guy keeping the peace.
Exactly. When John and Paul were at each other's throats, or if George felt ignored, Epstein smoothed it over. He managed the massive egos.
So it's like the parents went away for the weekend.
Never came back.
Wow. Suddenly the kids are running the house.
And the kids started fighting almost immediately. The sources describe the band as being completely disoriented without him, and nature abhors a vacuum. With Epstein gone, Someone had to steer the ship, so Paul McCartney tried to step up.
And reading the accounts, I get the sense Paul genuinely thought he was saving the band. Like, someone has to book the studio time, someone needs a plan.
Oh, definitely.
But the others did not see it as leadership at all.
No, they didn't. Lennon, Harrison, and Starr saw it as bossiness. They felt he was becoming really domineering, telling them what to play, how to play it. The resentment just started to cook.
Right.
So by the time we get to 1968 and the recording of the White Album, the vibe in that studio was incredibly toxic.
See, I've always heard the White Album described as this sprawling masterpiece.
Yeah.
But the actual process of making it sounds like an absolute nightmare. There's a quote from Rolling Stone describing it as 4 solo albums under one roof.
That is the perfect description. The intuitive, mind-reading collaboration they used to have. It was just gone. You had Paul recording a song in one room, John in another room. They were essentially treating the other Beatles like hired backing musicians.
So come in and play the bass on my track.
Exactly.
And it got so bad that Ringo Starr, who was always the glue, the guy everyone liked, he actually quit the band.
He did. He literally walked out. He felt so isolated and unappreciated during those sessions that he just packed up, took his family to Sardinia for 2 weeks, and was completely done.
But he did come back. And I found this one detail in the timeline really touching amidst all the bitterness. When Ringo returned to the studio, George Harrison had decorated his entire drum kit with flowers.
Yeah, it was a rare moment of sweetness. But honestly, it was a Band-Aid on a bullet wound, because while they were patching things up with Ringo, a new factor had entered the studio that would permanently fracture their group dynamic. Yoko Ono.
Okay, we have to talk about this carefully, because the whole Yoko broke up the Beatles narrative is such an old cliche.
Right.
But looking objectively at the sources, it wasn't just that John had a new girlfriend. It was complete breach of their internal protocol, wasn't it?
Precisely. It really wasn't about Yoko as a person. It was about the sanctity of their workspace. The Beatles had an unwritten, ironclad rule for years. Wives and girlfriends were not allowed in the recording studio.
Never.
Never. The studio was their clubhouse. It was their sanctuary where they could be vulnerable, make mistakes, and experiment without judgment.
And John didn't just bring her to visit for an hour. She was there constantly, sitting right on the amps, whispering to John, even offering input on the musical arrangements.
Right. And for the other three, but particularly for George Harrison, this was a massive invasion. It broke their sacred circle. It fundamentally changed the chemistry of the room.
And John's reaction.
Lennon was so devoted to her that his attitude was basically, if you want me, you get us as a package deal.
Wow.
But if we zoom out and connect this to the bigger picture, all this personal friction was actually manageable compared to the business war that exploded in 1969.
Yes. This is the part that I think always gets overlooked. It's not as romantic or rock and roll as fighting over art or girlfriends, but this business dispute is what actually killed the band. The Alan Klein versus the Eastmans battle.
It is the killing blow, no question. By 1969, their company, Apple Corps, was hemorrhaging money. They were being robbed blind by hangers-on. They desperately needed a new manager to stop the bleeding.
And here is where the massive split happens. Paul wants his father-in-law, Lee Eastman, to run the band. Which on one hand you can understand. Keep it in the family, trust the people you know.
Sure, but look at it from the perspective of John, George, and Ringo. If Paul's father-in-law is the manager, Paul holds all the cards.
Oh, totally.
They felt it would be a complete corporate takeover by McCartney, so they wanted this guy named Alan Klein.
Because Klein had quite the reputation. He managed the Rolling Stones, right?
He did, and he was a shark. He was known in the industry for being completely ruthless, for going after record labels and extracting huge checks. The other three Beatles wanted a shark to go bite all the people who were ripping them off.
Right, they wanted a fighter.
They wanted someone who would fight for them, not someone who was firmly allied with Paul.
So it becomes this rigid 3-against-1 vote. And this is where the conflict moves from, I don't like how you played that guitar riff, to, I am getting my lawyers and I'm going to sue you.
It got incredibly ugly, and during all this chaos, they actually lost control of their own publishing company, Northern Songs.
Let's pause there for a second. For anyone listening who isn't deep into music industry jargon, why was losing Northern Songs such an absolute disaster?
Okay, think of it this way. In the music business, there are 2 separate copyrights for any track. There's the recording, the actual audio file or tape you listen to, and then there's the publishing.
The actual writing of the song.
Right, the songwriting itself, the notes and lyrics on paper. Publishing is where the real generational long-term money is. Every time a song like Yesterday gets played on the radio or covered by another artist or used in a movie, the royalty check goes to the publisher.
So when the Beatles lost control of Northern songs during this boardroom war,
They essentially lost the mortgage on their own legacy. They were no longer the primary owners of their own life's work. The money was flowing to corporate investors, not to the guys who wrote the songs.
that is brutal.
It was, and that specific failure drove the wedge incredibly deep between Paul and the other three.
So by late 1969, the writing is completely on the wall. The trust is gone, the finances are a mess, and the timeline points to this very specific meeting on September 20, 1969. And this meeting is just dripping with irony.
That date is crucial, September 20th. The band is gathered in London for a business meeting. John Lennon looks at the rest of them and basically drops the bomb. He tells them he's leaving the band. He literally asked for a divorce.
I want a divorce. Just like that. But here's where it gets absolutely wild to me. On that exact same day, while John is quitting, the band is actively signing a new contract.
Yes. They were putting their signatures on a massive, highly lucrative royalty deal with Capitol Records. It was the exact deal that would finally secure their financial future.
Imagine the tension in that room. You're sitting there, signing a legal document binding you together to make millions of dollars, while simultaneously the founder of the band is looking at you saying, I'm out.
Right. It's exactly like signing a 30-year mortgage with your spouse while the divorce papers are sitting in your back pocket.
That is a perfect analogy. And because of that Capitol Records deal, Alan Klein and Paul McCartney basically begged John to keep his mouth shut. They couldn't let the news get out to the public, or it might jeopardize the contract they just signed.
So John agreed. He kept the secret.
Which brings us to April 1970, the betrayal. Because John kept quiet, but Paul decided he was going to control the narrative.
Paul was getting ready to release his very first solo album, simply titled McCartney, and inside the advance press copies sent out to journalists, he included a self-interview.
A self-interview.
Yeah.
Which is such a weird PR move. I'm going to interview myself.
It was a highly calculated maneuver. In that questionnaire, he explicitly asked himself, do you foresee a time when Lennon-McCartney becomes an active songwriting partnership again? And his printed answer was no.
He beat John to the punch.
He absolutely did. The headlines all over the world the next day were, Paul quits the Beatles. John was furious. He felt totally blindsided. He famously told the press, he didn't quit, I sacked him. It took this very private, painful heartbreak and turned it into a massive public spectacle.
And then came the lawsuits we mentioned.
Years of them. McCartney actually had to sue the other three Beatles in the high court just to dissolve the legal partnership.
Suing his best friends.
He felt it was the only possible way to escape Alan Klein's management. He had to sue his friends to save the music, and the official legal dissolution didn't even finalize until 1974.
So for 4 entire years, they were legally trapped in this zombie state. And the anger didn't just stay in the courtroom. It spilled right onto the vinyl.
It became lyrical warfare. Paul took direct shots at John on his 1971 album Ram, specifically with the song Too Many People. He was criticizing John's public preaching about peace while simultaneously destroying the band.
And John punched back hard.
He did. On the Imagine album, John released a track called How Do You Sleep? It is a vicious personal takedown. He mocks Paul's music, calls it muzak, and attacks his character. It was incredibly public and incredibly painful for both of them.
It took a really long time for that ice to thaw. I mean, we all know John was tragically murdered in 1980, and by then they had reached a sort of private peace, but they never reunited musically. It wasn't until the mid-90s, more than 2 decades after the breakup, that the remaining 3 even tried to make music together again.
Right. This was for the Anthology Project in 1994 and 1995. Paul, George, and Ringo reunited to tell their definitive story in a documentary series. And Yoko Ono extended a massive olive branch. She gave Paul a cassette tape.
The famous For Paul cassette.
Exactly. It contained these very low-fidelity demos that John had recorded at a piano in his New York apartment in the late 70s.
And from that specific tape, they managed to create 2 new songs, Free as a Bird and Real Love. I remember when those came out in the 90s. They were huge cultural events. But there was actually a third song on that tape, wasn't there?
There was. A track called Now and Then. And they really tried to work on it in 1995. They spent an entire afternoon in the studio messing around with it, but they hit a massive wall.
It's a technology problem.
It was a physics problem, really. On that cassette, John's voice was completely buried.
Ugh.
He was playing the piano loudly, and the single cheap microphone was capturing both the voice and the piano at the exact same time on one track. Plus, there was a terrible hiss on the tape, maybe even a TV humming in the background. It was an audio mess.
And George Harrison was having none of it.
George listened to it and called the vocal quality rubbish. He basically said, "We can't use this, it's not up to standard," and he pulled the plug. And honestly, looking at the studio tech they had back in 1995, he was entirely right. You just couldn't fix a degraded cassette tape with 90s computers.
Right.
So the song essentially went into a coma for nearly 30 years.
So what changed? How do we jump from George calling it rubbish in 1995 to a pristine #1 hit in 2023?
A documentary changed everything. Specifically, The Beatles, Get Back, directed by Peter Jackson, which came out in 2021.
That documentary was incredible. Watching them interact in the studio in real time, it really rewrote the historical narrative of those final days. But how did a movie director help finish a song?
It was the audio tools Peter Jackson's team built to make that movie. They had all this old mono documentary footage where the audio was just mashed together. Guitars, voices, drums, background noise, all baked onto one single track. So they developed a proprietary software called Mel Machine Audio Learning.
Named after Mal Evans, their longtime roadie. I love that touch.
It's a great tribute. Now, we really need to clarify what this software actually does, because when people today hear the letters AI in the same sentence as the Beatles, they freak out. They think it's a deep fake.
Right, they assume it's a computer just pretending to be John Lennon singing.
And the technical reports are very clear. That is absolutely not what happened. This is not generative AI creating something new. It's source separation. Think of it like making a cake. Once you bake a cake, you mix the flour, the eggs, the sugar, the milk, and put it in the oven. You can't take the eggs back out, right? They're chemically bonded.
Right, that's exactly how audio recording works. Once it's mixed down to a single mono track, it's baked. You can't unmix it.
Exactly. But UMAL is like a magic chemical process that allows you to unbake the cake. It can look at the chaotic waveform of that cassette tape and say, okay, this specific frequency is the piano, this frequency is the tape hiss, and this specific frequency right here is John. And it can extract just the egg, just the voice.
That is wild. So they could finally get John's original vocal completely clean.
Yeah.
Without the muddy piano drowning him out.
Crystal clean. Paul McCartney said listening to it was like John had just walked into the room. Once they had that pristine vocal isolated, the obstruction from 1995 was totally gone. They could finally finish the song.
But they had another major problem. George Harrison passed away in 2001. You can't have a Beatles reunion without George.
But they had the session recordings from 1995. Remember, they worked on Now and Then for one afternoon before giving up. George had laid down some acoustic rhythm guitar tracks before he called it quits.
Oh, wow.
So they took those 90s recordings, isolated and kept George's guitar parts, and then Paul and Ringo went into the studio in 2022 to record brand new bass and drum parts.
Talk about a mind-bending timeline. You have John's vocal from the late 70s, George's guitar from the mid-90s, and Paul and Ringo playing as men in their 80s in the 2020s.
It is a musical collage across time, and Paul did something really special to finish it off. The song needed a guitar solo. So Paul played a slide guitar solo himself, but he played it entirely in the signature style of George Harrison. It was a very intentional tribute. He wanted the record to sound like George was there playing it.
And the result of all this work across all these decades, well, we mentioned it at the top of the show, a #1 hit in the UK.
November 2023. It broke chart records. But more than the commercial success, it represents a profound sense of closure. It is the very last song to feature all four Beatles playing together, yet created across 5 different decades.
It really is the long and winding road. From the terrifying circus of Shea Stadium, through those bitter courtroom battles, the personal tragedies, and finally, a digitally assisted reunion. It feels like the technology finally caught up to the emotion they wanted to express.
It does, and honestly, this raises a fascinating philosophical question for you to chew on as a listener. Have you ever heard of the Ship of Theseus paradox?
Remind me how that one goes.
It's an ancient thought experiment. If you have a famous ship, and over the years as it ages, you slowly replace every single plank of wood, every sail, and every nail with new materials, Is it still fundamentally the same ship?
Oh, I see exactly where you're going with this.
Right. If a band isn't even in the same room, if they aren't even alive at the same time, if the lead vocal is extracted by an algorithm and the rhythm guitar was recorded 30 years ago, is it still the Beatles?
That is the ultimate question.
Does a piece of music belong to the moment it was originally written? Or does it belong to the moment the technology finally caught up to save it? Is Now and Then truly a Beatles song? Or is it a postscript written by modern technology?
I think the answer might just be in the listening. When you put on headphones and you hear those harmonies lock in, it doesn't feel like a science experiment. It feels like the band.
It really does. Against all odds, it sounds like four friends playing together one last time.
And maybe that's all that matters in the end. Well, that is all the time we have for this deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey, and we'll catch you on the next one.